offices around the world. And we are pleased to work here in the House of Representatives with the Congressional Israel Allies Caucus, with Doug Lamborn, Trent Franks, Elliot Engel, and Shelley Berkeley as our co-chairs. The issue of the peace process seems to have dropped to the bottom of the priority list here in Washington, and so with this event we intend, or we hope, to raise the debate again, to restart the discussion. The election, Syria, Egypt, all these things have seemed to have taken the headlines lately, but this issue is critical, and to deal with it now is very important. It is our intention that all viewpoints will be heard at this event, and to show clearly that the status quo is not a foregone conclusion, but that we can do better. For many years, alternate ideas have been marginalized, and anything that was in Oslo was considered extreme. That type of thinking has much to prove today, where we are in a place 20 years down the road and are no further. Before we begin, I just want to give one technical note that we were supposed to have Minister Benny Begin give some remarks, but he was unavailable for today. So with that, I'd like to ask Congressman Doug Lamour to come up and give a welcome. He's one of our hosts today, and as I mentioned, one of the co-chairs of the caucus. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Willow. The foundation staff members have done a great job putting this together, and I think we should recognize them and give them a hand. So Willow, Amy, and others, thank you for the hard work that you're doing. This is an important issue. I'm very honored to be one of the 4 co-chairmen of this important caucus. You're going to be hearing a little bit more from Trent Franks of Arizona in a few minutes. It's an honor to serve with him, as well as the bipartisan hosts that we also have, Elliot Engel and Shelley Berkeley, great people that it's an honor for me to work with. This foundation and this caucus really does some important things, and we could talk all morning about that, but you're here to hear about Oslo. And what happened 20 years ago, many people had high hopes that it would be a success. 20 years later, what do we have to show for it? And we should examine what went wrong, where we stand now. We should look and be willing to look at creative approaches going forward. Everyone wants peace in the Middle East. How to get there, though, you have so many views and opinions and directions. So I look forward to hearing as much as I can from the panelists, the very distinguished panelists, one of which is here seated, another panel will be up a little bit later. So this is going to be a great event. Thank you for joining us. And I now am going to introduce Trent Franks, representative from Arizona. Trent, my good friend.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate working with this man. He is from Colorado. I used to live there many years ago, so we feel like we have some good connection, and I really appreciate Doug Lamborn. He's one of the great and most committed champions of Israel we have in the Congress. And I understand that Shelley Berkeley and Elliot Engel are not here this morning, but I want you to know that they are deeply committed partners to this, and I would also express appreciation to the staff here of the American Israel Allies Caucus. And just all of you, I understand that there are many people here in this room that have a great love for Israel. And as you know, there are those of us who have prayed for the peace of Jerusalem ever since we were little children. And so you must understand that the commonality that we have in this room today is, again, that great commitment to Israel. I think it was Elie Wiesel said that, those of us that are evangelical Christians, Mike Sodrell and his wife Keeter are here. Mike and I came to Congress together. And you know that the greatest and most committed support for Israel is among some of the evangelicals on the Hill. And Elie Wiesel said it best. He said, when you come into Israel for the very first time, if you've never been there before, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Christian, it's still a homecoming. And so there's, again, an abiding commitment here and a great commonality. But there's also an understanding that this peace process that was envisioned very differently 20 years ago has met with great failures. And I want you to, I guess I'd ask you for diplomatic immunity in phrasing in those terms. But let me suggest to you that I think there are better ways and better hopes. And also, let me say to you that I believe that Israel faces some of the greatest challenges it's ever faced. Many of you know that yesterday in Sofia, Bulgaria, young Israeli youth traveling on a bus were blown to pieces, and it just seems like we are enough isolated from those tragedies that we forget how real they are. And I remember Golda Meir's comments. She said that in our long war with the Arabs, Israel's always had a secret weapon, no alternative. And we don't understand sometimes the matrix and the challenge that Israel finds themselves in every moment of their existence. They're always faced with this terrible threat of death and suffering and instantaneous tragedy. So I want to ask for a moment that we would just have a moment of silence for the victims lost in Sofia, Bulgaria yesterday. God grant the victims peace, their families peace, and may their deaths not be in vain. In a moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Jonathan Schanzer to come forward. And I wish so much that I could stay here for the entire discussion. I cannot. Sometimes, as Doug will tell you, our time is, Rabbi, it's good to see you, sir. I did not mean to Rabbi Elon. But let me just say to you that I would love to be here for the whole event, but there are those of us, like Doug and others, that are continuing in a great spirit of trying to do everything that we can in these critical days for Israel, whether it's preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons or making sure that the people of Israel do not believe, because of some of the administration policies here, that the heartland of America has any less commitment for Israel than they ever did. And I hope that we all recognize the destiny year that we're in. And again, diplomatic immunity is still in vogue here. Please understand that the decisions we make in the elections this fall will have the most profound impact on the future of Israel. And with that nonpartisan statement, I want to ask Dr. Jonathan Schanzer to come forward. And thank you all. God bless you all for being here.
Let me just introduce Dr. Schanzer quickly, because we want you to know who he is and why we're so pleased to have him as our moderator.
Served as an officer at the Israeli Defense Forces and as coordinator of negotiations with the PLO. She served as assistant foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. She is a prolific and distinctive voice and author of a book that I actually reviewed called Shackled Warrior. Next to her is Ghaith al-Omari. He is Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He previously served as the Director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President and is a former advisor to Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. Formerly an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the Camp David Summit and the Tava talks, Ghaith was also the Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative. He has participated in leading negotiations and peace agreements among Palestinian and Israeli public officials. And I would just, on a personal note, just say that Ghaith is a terrific analyst of Palestinian domestic affairs. He and I have appeared together on several occasions. He is a champion of the peace process, but in a way that I think has always been fair and realistic, and I look forward to hearing from him today. And then finally, we have Danon. He currently serves as a member of the Knesset for the Likud party. He is chairman of the World Likud Organization and chair of the Knesset Committee for Immigration and Absorption. He is a veteran of the IDF, I believe at the rank of lieutenant, and has been in the Knesset since 2006, correct? 2009? Okay, I saw 2, so I gave you the benefit of the doubt. At any rate, so we're going to start this morning by giving each panelist 5 minutes. Again, I will give you notice when your time is running out. I will be strict. We want to keep this at 5 minutes so we can launch into a discussion after that. And so, Caroline, if you'd like to begin, please do. I think you can sit right from there if you'd like.
Can't see,
Oh,
that's
then
the
you'd
problem,
like to stand up?
short people like me. Hi, good morning. Thank you all very much for coming to this important event. I see a lot of very good and old and dear friends of mine personally and of Israel, and I just want to thank the chairman of this event for giving us your auspices, your honorable auspices, and I want to thank everybody here as well for American support for Israel, which is so important to our country, to both countries. So we're discussing a very important topic here, which is both the reasons for the failure of the Oslo process as well as the way forward, which I think is the next panel. So I just want to very briefly take my 5 minutes to discuss a couple of the basic reasons why I'm quite certain have led to the failure of the peace process as presently construed with the PLO. I think the first and most important reason that it has met with such abject failure for so long is because the entire peace process between Israel and the PLO is based upon a set of false assumptions, the most important of which is that the cause of the Israeli-Arab conflict writ large, as well as the Palestinian conflict with Israel, is due to the absence of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. And that the view that assumption has brought about the view that if such a state is founded on land that Israel presently controls or did control in 1993, that the conflict between the Arab world and Israel writ large, as well as the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel, would immediately disappear, and we would enter into a messianic era of redemption. And the problem with that is that it is a false assumption, because what we've seen over the past decade is that the Palestinians have continuously rejected statehood. This is not the goal for which they seem to be, that they're seeking to address, rather they are looking for something else. And when it was offered them in 2000 at Camp David, not only did they reject it, they didn't offer anything instead of the offer that Ehud Barak had offered them at Camp David, and instead they went to war, launching the worst terrorist offensive that Israel had seen since the pre-state days. So it's not at all clear that the Palestinians want the state that everybody says, the absence of which is the cause of the Arab conflict with Israel. And it is also not at all clear that the problem for the Arab world is the size of Israel. Rather, in both cases, both in the case of the Palestinians as well as in the case of the wider Arab world, it has become clear over the past 20 years that the problem is Israel's actual existence, not the size of Israel, but rather the fact that Israel exists in any size. And therefore, when you seek to address the question of the size of Israel as opposed to the Arab world's rejection of Israel's right to exist, you're actually addressing the wrong question. And the problem then is not something that Israel can solve, because Israel doesn't have the capacity, by the way, neither does the United States, to change the hearts and minds of the Arab world, or to change the hearts and minds of the Palestinian people specifically. Rather, that's a decision that they're going to have to make internally, and until such change has happened, there is absolutely no way to resolve the Arab world's conflict with Israel. That is, it is their problem, not Israel's, and Israel therefore cannot solve the problem by contracting into a smaller territorial mass. And so I think that's one of the problems, and that's a basic problem. The other basic problem is when we hear the term two-state solution, we're not talking about a policy, we're talking about a prediction. We're saying that if a Palestinian state is established, that there will be peace, that will solve the conflict. But what we've seen, particularly since 2005, when Israel left the Gaza Strip entirely, and the Palestinians have, for the first time, had an area, geographical landmass that is entirely under their control, that they haven't used the Gaza Strip as former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon thought they would in order to build the institutions of a state. Rather, it's become one of the largest terror bases in the world, and it is controlled by the Hamas terrorist organization. It is used as a missile launching site against Israeli civilian population centers, and is increasingly, together with the Sinai Peninsula, becoming a hub of international terrorism.
30 seconds.
So those two things, both the idea that the assumption that the size of Israel and the absence of a Palestinian state on land controlled by Israel is the cause of the Arab conflict with Israel has been proven wrong, as well as has the question of what will happen in the event that the Palestinians are granted sovereignty. That is, if they are given control over a land mass, are they going to use it in order to live at peace with Israel or not? I think both of those basic assumptions are the assumptions upon which the Oslo process was predicated, and both have been proven wrong continuously, and a great human cost for the past 2 decades. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Caroline Ghaith, if you'd like to come up.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here and for being here. And I would like to note before I start, I think as the Congressman said, we are holding this event in the shadow of the tragic events of yesterday. And this is a very tragic and stark reminder that as much as some might wish the conflict away, the conflict is here. And unless we deal with it, it will continue to haunt us in these very personal, very tragic moments. It, for me, it reinforces the urgency and the need for this. I mean, we're talking about Oslo here, and I would say that it's easy in hindsight to find all of the flaws in Oslo, and there are many, but I think at a deep level, Oslo was pivotal in 3 ways. It was a game changer and a paradigm changers in 3 ways. One, it actually established mutual recognition between the Palestinians and Israel. And those of us old enough who have been involved in the conflict for so long know that this was a prerequisite for anything moving forward. Before Oslo, Palestinians and Israelis could not even officially talk together, and that was a criminal act. And it also opened the way for the Arab recognition of Israel through the Arab Peace Initiative in the Beilin Summit, which basically turned the conflict in the Arab world and Israel from an existential one about the actual existence of Israel, the way it was framed in the Khartoum summit of the late 60s, into one of real estate and how do you manage ending the conflict and ending the occupation. Secondly, it established the Palestinian Authority, which to me is a physical manifestation and nucleus for any future resolution. Now these 2 events, the mutual recognition and the PA, paved the way to the 2-state solution becoming policy. And it is policy. It's policy of the United States, of Israel, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, of the Palestinians and of the world together. To me, the 2-state solution is the only conflict-ending solution. There are many options besides that, status quo, many other options, but these are all recipes for the continuation of conflict, of the conflict. The only way you end it, in my view, is through a 2-state solution. Now, with all of these basic and I think fundamental contributions of Oslo, I think one of the major flaws in Oslo, not as a paradigm but as a process, is Palestinians, Israelis, and the United States, we have all become so enamored with negotiation. And in a sense, we have started confusing the goal, which is ending the conflict, with the tool, which is negotiations. And negotiations, let me say it very clearly, is the only way that you will end the conflict. Issues like Jerusalem, refugees, and security and territory are ones that can only be resolved by negotiations. And that's why, we learned from Bastards of Gaza. You have to understand and to agree on security arrangements in order to have peace become stable. However, I think by focusing too much on negotiations and putting all of our political capital in bringing negotiations, we have started, in a sense, instead confusing objective with tool, and started pushing for negotiations at times, like any tool. There are times for negotiations, and there are times where negotiations are not the best option. Today, I argue negotiations are not the best option because the Palestinians are not ready for the necessary compromises, the Israeli government is not ready for the necessary compromises, in political terms, I mean, not in fundamental terms, and the US is too busy, frankly, doing other issues, domestic and international. In this time, I think it's a mistake to spend and to too much on energy on negotiation, and we have to start looking at ways of moving forward in other areas. And I would say that one of these arenas presents itself very clearly. What's been happening on the ground with what Prime Minister Fayyad or the Palestinian Authority has been doing, building the Palestinian security sector in a new and rational way under US help, the other aspects of state building, And with the result of that, with the security cooperation that we see between the IDF and the Palestinians, which, according to IDF senior officials, is unprecedented and qualitatively different from what we had in the past, this was an opportunity. An opportunity when we could not reach negotiations to at least take realities on the ground that in a concrete and meaningful way affects the lives of Palestinians and Israelis, and to build on these and to expand on these in order to create the necessary political setting that will allow us to go back to negotiation. So today, I would say, while we need to continue pushing for a way to go back to a meaningful negotiation, I think we also have to be very clear that a negotiation that is doomed to fail, that the parties enter with the pre-assumption that they are entering it to position for failure of the other side, is not a positive way to move forward. Instead, let's look at what's happening on the ground, let's look at the security cooperation, and let's start looking for ways to capitalize on this in order to create the kind of momentum that is necessary to ultimately reach a conflict-ending resolution. And this conflict-ending resolution, in my view, can only be the two-state solution because every other alternative will be rejected by the Israelis or by the Palestinians. Thank you very much.
Mr. Danon, please.
Good morning, distinguished Congressman, Rabbi Elon, former Minister Yossi Beilin, my colleagues, I have a very good friend in the crowd, I cannot name you all. First of all, I was invited to Washington. I thought it would be nice and chilly, so I can run away from the heat wave in Israel. And I came last night and I saw I'm not running away from any heat wave. So it's, I promise you, when I will host you in the Knesset, as a member of the Israeli Caucus, it will be hot, but it will not be as humid as it is here in Washington. We can agree on one thing, all of us here today. Oslo is finished, dead, kaput, Halas, Terminado, you name it. It doesn't exist anymore. I know you are very big into environment issues in the US. Think about the amount of papers we wasted drafting the Oslo Accords. Nobody looks at the Accords today. Nobody relies on them from both sides. If you want to go and pray at the tomb of Joseph in Shechem, and we have some people who came from the Samaria here with us, that is the Ivri, you cannot do it. Even though it's written in the Oslo Accord, you are allowed to go and pray whenever you want. And the Palestinians will show us things from their side that are written in the Oslo Accord. So I think today we can learn that the Oslo Accord was a failure. By the way, I was here, it wasn't 19 years ago, I was here demonstrating against the Oslo Accord. And I don't feel happy to come here today and tell you, I told you so. It's not going to work. I will tell you, I told you so, a few times today. But I want to tell you what will be happening tomorrow. Let's speak about the vision. And I think we should learn from the failure of Oslo that the concept of Oslo failed. The concept of land for peace. For years we have been arguing in Israel whether it's land for peace or the other equation that we spoke about, the Jewish communities, or you refer to call them the settlements, whether they are essential for Israel or they are a burden for Israel. And today I'm telling you that we are all agreed that the land for peace equation does not exist anymore. And the Israelis were willing to pay a heavy price. Not me. I was against it from the beginning. But the majority of the Israelis were willing to pay a price for peace. Because it was a dream. You will pay, you will give land, and you will receive instant peace. It doesn't work anymore. And I think today we need to put a new equation on the table. That it is not a two-state solution. I think a two-state solution will not work anymore. We're looking at Gaza today, and we understand that if we want to see a Palestinian state, just look at Gaza today. And if you ask ourselves if we want to see another terror entity in our backyard, no, we do not. We do not want to see a terror entity in our backyard. And where I live, and where the majority of Israelis live, if there will be a state, a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, it will be exactly what you see today in Gaza. And with all due respect to Salam Fayyad and to Abu Mazen, we read the polls, and if there were proper elections today in the Palestinian Authority, no one can guarantee the result. And when we said that the Hamas will take over Gaza, some people told us, why you are so pessimistic? So we are not pessimistic, we are realistic. And I think today what I want to offer here is a new idea. It's a three-state solution, Mr. Lamour, not two-state solution. A three-state solution which is Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, period. There should not be a Palestinian state, a terror state, entity of terrorism. If I would tell you here in Washington, you want to form an Al-Qaeda state in your backyard, in Arlington or somewhere in Connecticut, you will say, why should we do that? And that's exactly what we are saying today. How can we reach this vision? It's hard. It's not a short-term vision. I know here in the US you like everything fast and now. Same in Israel. People want to go to have a diet and to see the results tomorrow morning. So the vision we're putting on the table, it's not a short-term vision. It can take years, 5 years, 15 years, 20 years, and we will build it from bottom up. Not like what happened in Oslo. In Oslo there was a nice ceremony in the White House, a nice photo op. People were happy. It wasn't for real. So I prefer to manage the conflict, not to resolve the conflict. So there will be no ceremony. You can tell the photographer, nothing will happen in the White House lawn in the next few years. We don't want more ceremonies. Because we saw what happened from those ceremonies. We had people being exploded, not in Bulgaria, in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. And I think if we are brave, the Jews who live in Israel, and we believe in the rights, the biblical right, the legal right, and the common sense right. What is the common sense right? We won the war. And when you win the war, you don't give a prize to somebody which attacked you. And I think if we will do that, we will come here in Washington and we will be able to present a three-state solution.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to your 5 minutes to discuss. We're going to have a discussion, the four of us, for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience here. Let me just first ask I think a question that at least is on my mind as someone who studies the Palestinian political spectrum. To what extent would the three of you argue that Hamas was largely responsible for the demise of the peace process? Whether you look at the suicide bombings, the rise in popularity of the rejectionist view of Hamas, or even the Hamas-Fatah split that ultimately created havoc within the Palestinian political spectrum. A lot of people would say that, if Hamas was just not part of the equation, we would be in a very different place. If you'd like to take a few minutes to each of you respond.
Start.
Please.
Look, I mean, rejectionism was going to be inevitable. Whether it was going to be Hamas or something else, it's going to be inevitable. Because what the Oslo and the peace process came with is a totally new paradigm from a Palestinian point of view. Moving from the paradigm of a Palestinian state all over historic Palestine, i.e. destroying Israel, into a new paradigm that recognizes Israel, as happened in '93 with the exchange of letters. And it was natural that there will be opposition to that. Now, like I think in every nascent nation, in every new nation that is being built, there are competing paradigms of who's going to define the nation. And these paradigms are simply irreconcilable. If you look at what Hamas stands for, a theocracy that's based on destroying Israel, achieved through terrorism, as opposed to what the PLO stands for, which is a two-state solution reached through diplomacy, creating a secular, maybe socially conservative, or secular Palestinian state. These are paradigms that are irreconcilable, and they will continue to fight. Now, who's going to win is a question of who's going to deliver. And I think the failure to deliver, whether failure to deliver on the diplomatic front through negotiations, or the failure of the PA to deliver in terms of governance and domestic issues and the corruption that we saw in the 90s, have both led to the ascendancy of Hamas. The fight is not over. As of yet, neither party can claim that they represent or that they control the Palestinian political scene. The polls that Danny talked about actually today say that Abbas and Fayyad will win more than Hamas, but that's changeable based on the situation on the ground. So the challenge for me right now is which of the paradigms will be validated? Is the paradigm that talks about reasonableness producing results, which is I think what Fayyad and what Abbas are working on and trying to change things from the ground up, as Danny mentioned? Or is it the paradigm that Israel only responds to violence, which is the way that Hamas spun the whole Gaza offensive? The conflict is there, both in the internal conflict, both on the diplomatic front, but also on the domestic front. And that's what I look at what Fayyad is doing, and look at it as essential, rooting out corruption from the PA and creating a responsible, efficient, effective government is the second part of the equation of ensuring that the paradigm that I believe in, the paradigm of a Palestinian secular state side by side with Israel, is the one that's going to win.
The Palestinians had their chance. They chose, they made it the choice already. They chose to work with Hamas. They chose to sign an agreement with Hamas. By the way, the Hamas was the only organization which condemned the assassination of Osama bin Laden. The only organization worldwide. And Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad, they chose to go to bed with Hamas. And now they ask themselves what happened to us. And I think the decision they made not to fight the radical forces, now it's too late for them. Today, Salam Fayyad is afraid to go to Gaza. And same with Abu Mazen, because if you will go there, not me, I will not be safe there and you will not be safe there, but Salam Fayyad will not be safe today in Gaza. Because the minute he chose not to fight them, he lost it, and today it is too late.
You know, I think that in a way, both of the gentlemen sitting here with me are correct, but I think that it's important also to note that the majority of terrorism carried out against Israel, particularly since 2000, has been carried out by Fatah-affiliated organizations. The largest number of fatal attacks against Israel were carried out by Fatah, not by Hamas. And so I think that while it's important to look at the competition between Hamas and Fatah as a cause of the escalation of violence or the radicalization of Fatah PLO policies towards Israel, I think that we have to acknowledge the basic duplicity of Arafat and the Fatah leaders in 1993 when they claimed at Oslo and in the White House and in the peace negotiations that followed that they had abjured terrorism in favor of negotiations with Israel. I think that we have to recognize that. We have to also recognize that there aren't Palestinian leaders who have condemned terrorism as such, that they have stated, people, doves like Sari Nusseibeh and others have said that they consider it to be too costly from a political perspective, that it's not cost effective, it doesn't lead them to the goals that they wish to achieve, and therefore it shouldn't be carried out. But they haven't said that terrorism is inherently wrong. And so, you know, yes, in terms of all of the bad governance, the corruption endemic in the Palestinian Authority and so on and so forth, all of those are important, and I just want to bring it up to date, which is that last week, Sa'ar Tzur, who is the outgoing brigade commander in the Benjamin region, which is by Jerusalem in Judea, gave an interview to Israel Hayom, and he said that the Palestinian security forces that are being trained and funded by the United States of America are much less inclined to fight terrorism. The IDF has had to step up dramatically its counter-terror operations in Judea and Samaria in the past several weeks since the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange on the one hand, and on the other hand, because every time that there is a reinstitution in one way or another of contacts between Fatah and Hamas towards the goal of establishing, again, a unity government between these two movements, the Palestinian security forces led by Salam Fayyad and financed by U.S. taxpayers and trained by the U.S. military are much less willing to participate in counter-terrorist operations, and they're seeing it on the ground today in Judea and Samaria. And lastly, yesterday, Abu Mazen met with the new president from the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, and today Khalid Mashal, the head of Hamas, is meeting with Morsi. And here too, the reports coming out today are that as a consequence largely of the Muslim Brotherhood's rise to power in Egypt, Fatah is of course much more weakened. Hamas, which is a Muslim Brotherhood organization, has been massively strengthened. And the likelihood that Fatah under these conditions is going to moderate its position towards Israel is, I think, negligible.
Ghaith, I saw you shaking your head. That either meant that you had too much coffee or you want to disagree with something.
It could be both, actually. I mean, just a couple of points of fact. First of all, I mean, Prime Minister Fayyad, at least, has been very clear that he will not serve in any unity government because he believes in the clear separation and the clear reconcilability of the two paradigms. So at least we have that to stand on record. And the second one is the issue of condemnation of terrorism. I know for a fact that Fayyad himself quite recently came out and said it's not only counterproductive, but it's morally wrong. And I think that's the foundation. And I would add to that, I myself was an advisor or staffer for Abbas when he was Prime Minister in the Aqaba summit with Prime Minister Sharon. I am the one who wrote his speech in which I was very deliberately included the rejection of the armed intifada and of violence, not only as a matter of that is counterproductive, but also as a matter that is morally wrong, and it's one that affects the actual moral fabric of the Palestinian society. So there has been this clear condemnation. Now, I would go there to the point that you, I think you, Caroline, mentioned, which is the point relating to Fatah being responsible for a lot of the terrorism. And you are absolutely true. And I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that is why what we saw as in building these new security forces, a great emphasis on disarming and going after not only Hamas, but the Fatah brigades, the Fatah action. And we saw also the movement from disempowering and defunding some of the security services that in the past have worked as militias and as terror cells to create a more rational, responsive Palestinian security sector. And again, I mean, I only need to talk to Gadi Ashkenazis of this world and the Israeli officers who were dealing with that to know there's been a qualitative difference. Now, this security building and the security cooperation is not perpetual. Ultimately, if it's not met with an equivalent developments on the political front, whereby those security officers can say that what we are doing is producing the political dividend, it will fray. This is what Keith Dayton himself said 3-4 years ago in this town, and we're starting to see the manifestations. Still, I believe we have a coherent security sector, we still have a degree of security cooperation, but we have to find ways of bolstering it and making sure that it becomes at least insulated from the tit for tat and kind of political conflict and diplomatic posturing that we see.
Okay. I want to try to pull back from getting too much in the weeds. It's very easy to start getting into point and counterpoint. We are here to talk about the two-state solution or 20 years after Oslo. So let me just, and you can feel free to bring in some of these thoughts if you've got additional thoughts that you'd like to add. But let me just ask this. You guys have all worked for Israel or the Palestinian Authority. Was it always the official policy of both governments that there would be two states? That ultimately that was the goal?
Let's talk about facts. And my colleague said that the Israeli policy is a two-state solution. So the Israeli government never approved the decision that is supporting a two-state solution, period. My party, which is the ruling party of the government, never approved any motion of a two-state solution. On the contrary, Prime Minister Netanyahu led a decision within the Central Committee opposing a two-state solution. So the official platform of my party, which I represent today, the Likud party, is against a two-state solution. We're all aware of the Beilin speech that was delivered by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but the official policy, and today if you ask the people within the government if they think it is viable, they will tell you, some of them say it's a dream, some will say it's a wishful thinking. I think the majority will say it's finished.
I don't remember the question.
I'll ask it again.
I mean, look, ultimately, as I look at Israel, I don't look at the positions of various parties. I look at what the Prime Minister has said. And if the Prime Minister doesn't speak for Israel, it becomes very hard to do any official business here. I mean, the Prime Minister either speaks for Israel or doesn't speak for Israel. Parties have their own lines, and they're entitled to them. But to your point, no, it has not always been the position. I mean, it's been the position of the Palestinians, I would say since Oslo, but what was very interesting, and even as we were negotiating with the Barak government, I don't think that Prime Minister Barak, as a Prime Minister, correct me if I'm wrong, ever uttered the word Palestinian state. Clinton never uttered the word Palestinian state. It took George W. Bush, to actually make it policy here. And this is what often people tend to forget. This in itself is not such an ancient concept. This is a new concept reached after realizing that all the other alternatives are worse. No one thinks that this is the perfect alternative, it's like democracy, as they say. But ultimately, after rounds and rounds of negotiating and talking and conflict, we realize that this is the only one that can actually balance the interests of both sides, not give them all that they want, but it's the only possible in the long-term stable solution.
I think, first of all, Danny is absolutely right. It isn't the official policy of the Israeli government to establish a Palestinian state. It's something that Netanyahu expressed his support for in that speech at Beilin University, but it is not the official position of the Israeli government. And by the way, it wasn't the official position of the Rabbi government, as like you said, it wasn't even stated by Ehud Barak openly, and the first major leader who did so was George Bush in 2002. And so, we have to actually think about this, because what we've been talking about is a policy that nobody wanted a state, the establishment of a Palestinian state. They've been calling it a two-state solution. They haven't called it what it is, because the truth of the matter is that all of the evidence that we've seen on the ground leads us to the conclusion that this isn't going to solve anything. Again, you mentioned that there's been a speech here or there by Abbas saying that terrorism is inherently evil, perhaps, but on a daily basis he's glorifying terrorists. He meets with released terrorist murderers from Israeli prisons, and he names soccer fields after mass murderers. So this is not the kind of behavior that one would expect from somebody who's considered a pragmatic leader of Israel. And by the way, Salam Fayyad, he came here to the United States. He gave a speech at the Aspen Institute in their conference where he said that of course Jews would be allowed to live in the Palestinian state. I know because it was an answer to a question by a friend of mine, Jim Woolsey, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, that he said that. But then in a later statement in Arabic, I believe it was, in Normali, he said no, that no Jews would be allowed to live in the state of Palestine. So what we're really talking about here is the establishment of a racist, bigoted state in which, from the get-go, Israel is supposed to be required to force all of the Jews who live on the land that the Palestinians wish to live on and to establish their states presumptively in Judea and Samaria upon, to force all the Jews to leave their homes, to forcibly expel all of these Jews who live in their homes. And this is not something that is a defensible position, and therefore we use all sorts of euphemisms to discuss it. We presuppose that it's a reasonable demand when in fact, again, when we look at the basic parameters that all of these discussions are based upon, these are parameters that are antithetical to all of our values. And yet we never discuss that because we use platitudes like two-state solution, Palestinian statehood, all sorts of things, peace, peace, peace. And they really are not resonating at all on the ground. And when we look at the actual positions, the moral basis of the positions of the Palestinians that they're bringing to the negotiating table with Israel, we see that these are actually repugnant to our values and to the cause of peace.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. And this will be sort of a big one. We haven't talked about the role of America yet. America has been the midwife, the shepherd, I would say lately the whipping boy of the peace process. When you talk to people on both sides of this issue, they will say, the U.S. continues to blindly support Israel while Israel builds settlements, and they basically flaunt international law, or international agreements. And then there are those on the other side who would say that U.S. aid has lined the pockets of the Palestinian leadership, that they've grown corrupt, that they basically, especially since the rise of Hamas and the takeover of Gaza, that we've just sort of empowered the PA to continue to do whatever it wishes to do without being held accountable. Has the role of the United States been as bad as everybody says? Was there a moment where the United States was doing the right thing, and at what moment did the United States go wrong? Or was it just the fact that the United States was shepherding this process from the beginning, which is, I think, maybe what some of you would say. But I'm curious to hear about what you, all three of you, think about the role of the U.S. as it has evolved, and really where things started to go wrong.
I'll go first since I was going.
Please.
I think that until 1993, the United States and Israel were essentially on the same page because both Resolution 242 of the UN Security Council and 338, which is just a reinstatement of 242, was based upon the proposition that Israel would make changes in its borders in the land that it had already, that it took control over during the 1967 Six-Day War in exchange for peace, but that before any of that could happen, the Arab world had to recognize Israel's right to exist within secure and defensive borders. So that the emphasis of U.S. policy until 1993 was where I think it should have been, which was that in order for anything to be resolved in the Middle East, first the Arab world had to change its position on Israel. It had to recognize Israel's right to exist as the Jewish state. And again, the false assumption upon which Oslo is based was that it was the absence of a Palestinian state rather than the Arab world's rejection of Israel's right to exist that was the cause of the conflict. And I think that once, both Israel, by the way, but also particularly the United States, embraced that false assumption in 1993 with the onset of the Oslo Accords, U.S. policy towards the Middle East in its entirety, and specifically again towards Israel, has become extremely mixed up. Because if the conflict in the Middle East, if the instability of the Arab world is due to the absence of a Palestinian state, and the reason that there's no Palestinian state is because Israel controls the areas that the Palestinian state is supposed to be founded upon, then the United States has to change its perception of Israel as a strategic ally. Because Israel is no longer the bulwark of American values and American strategic interests, the front line, so to speak, of or the outpost of democracy in the Middle East. Rather, it is the reason why there's no peace. If Israel would simply yield that territory, then there would be. And so I think, on the one hand, you have the sentiments and to a certain degree the intellectual understanding of Israel's strategic importance to the United States that are the basis of the American alliance with Israel. But on the other hand, when your chief policy is based upon a presumption of Israeli guilt and Israeli culpability for the absence of peace in the region, then you necessarily develop a perception of Israel and base your policies on Israel on something that makes it very difficult for your own policymakers to remember why it is that Israel is important to you. And I think that when we, people like myself who write about this on a regular basis in the newspapers have had great criticism of the United States is because what we're criticizing is a policy that's based upon a misconception of reality. And I think, by the way, that today when we look at the rise of the radical Islamist forces throughout the Arab world as a result of the revolutionary developments in the Arab world, that we see that Israel's strategic importance as the frontline democracy, Western liberal democracy in the Middle East, has become inarguable yet again. And so that, when we look at the fact that today, with the rise of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that the United States has no stable ally any longer in the Middle East other than Israel, that Israel's importance to the U.S. has become more important. So you began this discussion, I think it was you, saying that it seems as though U.S. interest in the peace process is receding, and that would be reasonable because the massive changes that are now sweeping across the Arab world are making it so clear that this isn't the problem. That the absence of a Palestinian state is not the reason why the U.S. suffers from Islamic terrorism, is not the reason why the Middle East keeps exporting its terrorism to places like Burgas in Bulgaria and Argentina and so on and so forth. It is because of something else. And against that something else, the rise of radical Islam in this case, that Israel is such a critical ally to the United States, and the U.S.-Israel alliance is so vital to U.S. national security interests.
Ghaith, would you like to go?
I think, and here I would definitely disagree with Caroline, that the U.S.-Israel relations are a deep and, to quote the president, unshakable fact of life. And a good fact of life. I think what we see here, the amount of interest that this issue maintains, even though from a policy point of view it's on the back burner, is for me a very clear indication that this alliance is very deep and this alliance is unshakable. And it's an alliance that's actually positive and will help us if we are moving towards peacemaking. Simply because the US is and should remain the one friend that Israel can 100% trust. Not Europe, no one else. To move in the peace process, you do need that trusted partner that will hold your hand as you move into the scary unknown. And the US has to play this role and continues to play this role. And I think this is a very positive thing, and I'm not at all worried that this is something that's going to erode. This is a tenet of US foreign policy, and rightly so. I would say, though, that the US, in order for the US to remain influential, the US has to rely on a number of factors. Being loved is one of them, but being feared is another one. And I think this is something we have to keep in mind. US power is something that has to continue to be protected. And I think those who are advocating American declinism, or whatever they call it, are not doing this country or that region or the world any favor. This country is and has to remain the superpower for things, at least in our part of the world, to move. And finally, I would say, I think a very wrong premise that Palestinians have been part of creating, but not the only party in creating, is that having very strong Israeli-American relations is not something that needs to be undermined, but what needs to be worked on is developing parallel, equal, and not mutually exclusive, strong Palestinian-American relations. Because that is a part of the debate here that we do not see often reflected. And I'm very, very heartened when Secretary Clinton, in one of our events, my organization's events, came out and said it. You can be pro-Israel without being anti-Palestine, you can be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Israeli. And I think if we can create this kind of structures whereby Israeli-American relations are reinforced and reiterated repeatedly in a non-partisan way. And I think this is what makes the issue unique and fascinating to work with, while at the same time developing equal and equally tough but equally close Palestinian-American relations. We might have something that will facilitate our country here being more even successful in its efforts.
Mr. Danon.
I just finished writing a book about this issue, so I can speak for an hour. I will not do it.
I've
Relax.
got 3 minutes.
It will be out next month. You can buy it. It's called Israel, the Will to Prevail. I will do it in 3 minutes. 2 main points. One, President Obama made 2 mistakes. He tried to dictate the solution, to come and dictate and say, that's what you should do to the Israelis and to the Palestinians. You cannot dictate anything in the Middle East. I don't think you can do it here in the Capitol Hill, but in the Middle East you cannot do it. The second mistake, President Obama is being perceived as being one-sided today by Israelis. If in the past the Palestinians said, well, the Americans are pro-Israelis, today the people in Israel who supported Obama, he had 80% approval when he was elected. Today they look at him and say he's one-sided. He adopted all the demands of the Palestinians. 67 lines, refugees, Palestinian state, and he forgot about all what we're saying for years. And that is the main problem, because when Prime Minister Netanyahu stepped in the White House, he knew that in front of him he's dealing with the Palestinian leader, he was dealing with Mubarak, and the American president was thinking the same, like the people he's negotiating with. And it has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats. When Clinton was a mediator, He tried to bring both sides to the table and negotiate and push them. But President Obama chose to take the Palestinian side, and today many Israelis think he cannot be a mediator anymore because he adapted all the demands of the Palestinians. It is very hard today to come and tell the Palestinians, forget about what President Obama told you, so we are not going to accept it.
Okay, we're going to open up this discussion now to the audience. I will ask just a couple of things. First of all, in these settings, I don't know what it is about the Arab-Israeli conflict. When people ask questions, they usually come in 2s, 3s, or 4s. We're going to ask you to just keep it to one question and to keep it in the form of a question, and in fact, even a short question at that. So with that, we can start with Dan Pollock.
I'm Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. Thanks for being here. The question I have is about history and the causes of the failure of Oslo. When we look back at what was written at the time, it seems clear to me, and I want to see if everyone agrees, that Prime Minister Rabin expected Fatah to act to stifle the Islamic resistance that was much, much weaker then, and that he, in his vision, which maybe turned out to be wrong, once that prerequisite was done, then there was a possibility in his mind that peace could evolve without the instructionists having the kind of voice they've had. I think that we sometimes forget about that past, and the question is, given that false premise, was there really ever any chance of that happening? And each of your comments, thank you.
I think if there was one, there are many, but the main fatal flaw in the Palestinian behavior post-Oslo is the way that the Palestinians dealt with security. At the end of the day, I think I never knew Arafat closely enough, but I look at the behavior and I realized that it was not this absolute commitment to ending violence, and often violence was allowed to happen as a policy tool. And I think from a Palestinian point of view, I think this was one of the major mistakes that were made. And this is where I think Abbas, with his principled refusal of the use of violence, and then more importantly, maybe, or as importantly, Fayyad with taking these principles and putting them into practice, is what gives me hope now that things might be different. And if you look at the actual nature and behavior of the IDF, which in the mid to early 90s was very supportive of the Oslo deal, but I think to some extent based on soft hopes as opposed to hard realities. Today, and when the Intifada happened, obviously you had this backlash and we had this feeling of betrayal within the IDF. Today we are rebuilding the security trust, not in the way of the 90s based on hope and based on what I call fluffy warm feelings, but actually based on very cold, very gradual performance-based partnerships. And this is, I think, paradigm shift that I see now that I believe could create a grounds for future progress. So yes, the way security was dealt with was an issue, and I think we all learned lessons, and this is one of the lessons that we have learned from the Palestinian side. There were issues on the Israeli side, which I do believe that also have to be dealt with because it takes two to tango, and it does take two to fail in the process.
Any other responses?
Well, it's hard to say what Rabin would have said or what Prime Minister Sharon would have said. Maybe Dr. Beilin can say about Rabin. About Sharon, I was very close to Prime Minister Sharon until the disengagement from Gaza. Then I told him I cannot work with you anymore. I asked him, what will you do if it become a terror entity? So he told me, we will go in with our army and we will clean it up. And today we see we cannot do it. So I don't think we should try to analyze what would Rabin would have said, what Sharon would have said. We should look at the future and think what should be done for the benefit of the Israelis.
I think it's important also to just add to what Ghaith said, which was that to the extent, and I'm a little bit less optimistic or sanguine about the cooperation that Israel receives from the Palestinian security forces than you are, but I think that to the extent that there has sprung up on the ground cooperation between the two sides, that this actually argues for a perpetual Israeli control over Judea and Samaria rather than temporary control over Judea and Samaria. And I'm actually writing a book as well calling for the implementation of Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria in full. So I can take it that you guys are going to buy it. Anyway, but what I wanted to say in this regard is that, the basic presumption that Israel can subcontract our security or even our rights to the PLO, I think was wrong to begin with, fundamentally flawed, and has caused the deaths of over 1,000 Israelis. And what we've seen since 2002 in particular, but also before 1994 when we began to withdraw our forces and our military control over Judea and Samaria, is that Israel's security, whether it's in the Galilee, whether it's in Beit El, whether it's in Itamar, whether it's in Sderot, is a function, or in Kiryat Shmona, is a function of Israeli control over territory. It's not that, the problem is not that we're a friction between the two sides. The problem is that our enemies want to kill us. And that if we want them to not be able to succeed in that goal, then we have to control territory. The reason that we didn't see the kind of suicide terrorism from the Arab-Israeli community in the Galilee and the Negev 10 years ago that we saw emanating from places like Jenin is because Israel is sovereign in the Galilee, it's sovereign in the Negev. And it is not because we left, or the notion that we can ask somebody else to protect us is simply wrong. It's simply wrong, and it has cost us tremendous amounts of blood. Enormous costs in terms of the human toll that it's taken on Israeli society. So, I absolutely agree that we can and should live at peace with the Palestinians. I don't think that Israeli society is all racist. Israelis are perfectly happy everywhere throughout the country to live at peace with our Arab neighbors. And I think that what we found, though, is that the only way that we can do so with peace and security for all involved is for Israel to be in control of as much territory as possible. So thanks very much.
Yes, sir.
Pesach Lerner, National Council of Young Israel. My background is as a rabbi and a teacher, is education. I'd like your comments on how do we expect to have any peace when the educational process is going on as Palestinians, whether it's their textbooks or their summer camps or the naming of the soccer fields after suicide bombers. How could it be in that environment of hate? How do we ever expect the process to work?
Just a word on perpetual control. The one factor that you tend to put aside, and I think you told Danny when you talk about the three-state solution, is the Palestinians actually do want their state. They do not want to live under occupation. The Jordanians do want to be the Palestinian state, nor do the Egyptians. And therefore, I believe that if you have perpetual control, you have perpetual conflict. The conflict did not start with Oslo, and we cannot just wish it away. And I think the best, what we have to look at is ways to do it that will be acceptable to the Palestinians and to the Israelis. We can wish the Palestinian aspirations away, they will not go away. And that's why ultimately we got to the two-state solution paradigm, which will at least try to balance aspirations, to balance interests. And in doing so, by the way, and this might be an end to the question, we have to reconceive peace. And maybe even the word peace might not be the right one. And this is, again, when I look at our thoughts in the 90s, when we look at peace as this warm, fuzzy process that is more akin to courtship than it is anything else. Peace is divorce between Palestinians and Israelis. You go your way, I go my way, let's look at what are the basic interests that we have, and maybe in the future we'll be friends, maybe in the future we'll not be friends, but basically what you need is to end the conflict. You don't need to create war. And if I look frankly at the peace between Israel and Jordan, and Israel and Egypt, these are not warm peace. This is not warm peace. Jordanians or Egyptians are not enamored with Israelis, but this is a stable peace, because it's based on the issue of textbook, and the general issue, I guess, of incitement in that whole big umbrella. I would say two things. I mean, first of all, I do think that the issue has improved tremendously from the 90s until today, and I think, sadly, many of us still get our information from the period of the 90s, where many things were going that were wrong. Today, I see very systemic effort, at least in the education system, to move away from that. And that's one that I wish to see happening in parallel on both sides as well. The issue of incitement is a real issue, and it's a serious issue, and one that should be noted and should be called on. But it's just one component of a very complex and multifaceted matrix. And ultimately, if you, there are two ways of looking at it. There are many people who look at it as an excuse for not moving forward. And this is, by the way, a typical way of Palestinian and Israeli behavior. You look for something wrong that's being done by the other side, and use it as saying, they don't want to do anything, let me go back and retrench. I would rather look at some of the problems, some of the existing problems, some of the real problems, as issues that have to be resolved and have to be overcome. But I would not want to put any precondition on moving forward, because ultimately the longer that we kind of keep the conflict in its current state, the longer that we will end up having the same exact negative manifestations that we've been living for now for decades, or living with for decades.
One comment, I hear you, but Abu Mazen flew to Turkey to meet Amuna, the terrorist which seduced a young boy and he was killed in Ramallah. What he was thinking when he was flying to Turkey to meet him? What the message he was giving to the young Palestinians today in Ramallah by signaling to them she is a hero? And when I see those youngsters becoming involved in terrorist attacks like in Itamar and otherwise, it is connected to Fayyad and to Abu Mazen, who cannot condemn terrorism.
Just to underline what Danny was saying, there are certain things that you do that make it that one does, that the Palestinians have done, that render it impossible to accept the notion of giving them land, of viewing them as potential peace partners. And I think that the education system of the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian media, the way that they have demonized the Jewish people in the state of Israel and have indoctrinated their children to become murderers of Jews is something that is inexcusable, and it is something that renders them disqualified from being perceived as credible partners for peace with Israel. It is unforgivable. It is simply unforgivable. And I have not seen the kind of soul-searching among the Palestinian leaders that one would expect from a generation of leaders that has raised a generation of children to seek death, to value death more than life. And we see those messages translated to us on Palestinian television, where small children, nursery school children, my son's age, are dressed up as suicide bombers, are seen extolling the virtues of mass murder of Jews and saying that their highest aim in life is to become the people who kill my kids, and your kids, and all of our children. And I cannot reconcile that behavior with the notion that it is possible to achieve a peace in which the leaders who are enabling this process remain in charge. It's simply impossible for me to accept, and we've seen the results in the bloodbaths on the streets of Israel, and therefore, it's too late.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are, I think, running out of time. Do we have room for one or two more? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Now we've got 7 questions. Go figure. Okay, well, we'll have, let's see, we're going to have 1, 2, 3. If you want to maybe just go in order, ask your questions. Those are the ones that, Josh, you can go. Those are the ones that I spotted early. And so we'll have the 3 of you ask your questions, and then we'll let our panelists just pick which ones they'd like to answer, and then we'll try to wrap up.
Josh London, also with ZOA. Actually, this dovetails straight off the last question with an institutional gloss. Given UNRWA and its history, what it does, what it intends to continue to do, vis-a-vis incitement, education, all this other stuff, and the fact that it's not been part of the negotiation process, it's not been part of this equation, and they're still holding keys around the necks for 48, et cetera. How do any of you, or all of you, envision that working into re-envisioning peace, reimagining peace, restarting a process, et cetera?
Okay, that's question number 1. Question number 2.
Yeah, Warren Madison, the Unity Coalition for Israel. You touched upon an area, but I don't think you went into enough depth, and I'd like to explore that. When you said there's something else at work here fundamentally, which is why Oslo failed starting in 1993. And nobody's really addressed the issue of the continuous refusal of Abbas and other leaders to accept, to recognize a Jewish state in what they consider to be their region. We also seem to forget the Khartoum agreements in 1967, when the Arab League stated very clearly, no peace, no negotiation, no recognition. We also seem to forget that there were 3 occasions, not counting 3 occasions in 1920, but the United Nations, Oslo, the end of Oslo, Omar offering a Palestinian state, all didn't work. There's some other reason, and as Caroline said, something else is at work now, and I think that something else is that overall gorilla in the room, their refusal to accept and acknowledge the existence of a Jewish state in what they consider to be a Muslim area, their world. I'd like to see that addressed.
Okay, so the question is just in general, Palestinian acceptance or non-acceptance of a Jewish state. 3rd question.
Yes, Bill Koenig. New York Times wrote a couple weeks ago that Sheikh al-Jabari had a meeting with, in Hebron, he's a very popular Muslim. He's not very comfortable with the Palestinian Authority. Had a meeting with some Israeli officials, European officials, and he does not favor a 2-state solution. And he's extremely popular and has a lot of influence with a lot of Muslims. So I'd like to hear your position on that.
Okay, we've got 3 very different questions, and feel free to pick whichever one you'd like. Carolyn, would you like to start?
Sure. I think that, I'll just answer, I think the first and the third, because I already answered the second. But regarding UNRWA, I think that, again, this is This is an instance where you have an institution that by its very nature ensures that there is no such thing as a two-state solution. That is, that if a Palestinian state is established in Judea and Samaria along with the state that exists and has existed since 2005 in Gaza, that this will bring peace. Why? Because UNRWA is a UN agency that discriminates by its very charter against Palestinians, the Arabs, the descendants of Arabs who left Israel in 1948, and says, unlike every other refugee group in the entire world, you are never going to be allowed to be resettled in the areas that you have now lived in for 3 and 4 generations. You are never going to be allowed to be resettled because we are going to keep you in your refugee status in perpetuity until you and all of your descendants are allowed to move to Israel and overwhelm it and destroy it. This is not only, of course, an anti-Israel institution, it is an anti-Palestinian institution, and it has led to massive discrimination against these Palestinians, their descendants in places like Lebanon, where they are suffering under the apartheid regime, where they are not allowed to keep their state laws, they live under massive constraints by the Lebanese government. And in places like Syria, Jordan was the only country that gave them citizenship. This is a disaster. It is a disaster for the Palestinians, it is a disaster for Israel, and it is a disaster for these people who are suffering under this regime of discrimination by the United Nations. And I simply think that UNRWA, the only way to really move forward with the Palestinian issue, the suffering of the Palestinian people, is to liquidate UNRWA as an organization and transfer the responsibility of these poor people from UNRWA to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, just like every other group that has been displaced by war is administered under the UNHCR. And and I don't remember the third question, so I'm just going to end it at that. If we want peace, we have to close down UNRWA.
Again, unlike my colleagues, I am not writing the book, and I'm not.
You should.
I
got it.
The discipline needed to do that is a bit too much. But what I am, though, and what I have done in my past, especially for this context, is I do know enough about UNHCR and refugee law because this is actually my kind of education. And I would counsel, be careful what you wish for. Because if you look at UNHCR, the International Refugee Agency dealing with every other refugee situation, its actually mandate, its first mandate, and its primary mandate is to repatriate refugees to where they came from. And the reason why the Palestinian refugees were put outside UNHCR mandate is specifically knowing how the issue of refugees and the ultimate destination of the refugees is politically very sensitive and ultimately one that has to be resolved in the parties. That's why they do not have, UNRWA has more of a service mandate and less of resettlement or repatriation. Again, if we put them under HCR, then we are talking about a repatriation paradigm, which I think right now is not one that we want to go into. But in terms of UNRWA in general, putting aside the legalese, hard as it is, there was a lot of tremendous push to get UNRWA off the summer camp business, etc., and actually it worked. In Gaza right now, UNRWA cannot hold summer camps. So who is holding the summer camps? It's Hamas. The indoctrination that comes from Hamas. You might not be aware of that, but UNRWA's curricula do talk about two-state solution. They do have Israel on the map. They do have all of these issues. But if we start pushing some of the, what I believe are moderating influences, like UNRWA, let's be very careful of who's going to come and fill that vacuum, because often it's not the, that's the women of Brooklyn who are going to come in and fill this vacuum. It's going to be more negative elements. In terms of Khartoum and the issue of Jewish state, I think we often tend to overlook a very important major development that happened 2.5 decades or 3 decades, my math is bad, after Khartoum, which is the Arab Peace Initiative of the Beirut Summit. I think it was 02 or 03, I can't remember. 02, which basically says if there's an end to the Israeli occupation of Arab land, there will be recognition and normalization with Israel, which has changed the Khartoum paradigm from rejecting the existence of Israel to having it into a bilateral conflict that can be resolved, and once it's resolved, we have something to look forward in the future. So for me, that is a very important development that we have to weave more into our policy making. Just as the Jewish state, though, which is really, I think, the core of your question, and I would say the following, at least from my point of view. I don't speak for the Palestinian Authority, I no longer work for them. I would say that Israel was created for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to be the homeland of the Jewish people. That's a fact. That's a reality. And I think that is one that should not be and cannot be contested. But I would, again, counsel about what we do in the diplomatic process. I would say, if you put anything in the Palestinian-Israeli negotiating context on the table, then you've opened it to negotiations. I have always been an advocate that we should not, in the diplomatic process, negotiate or deal with issues of our respective narratives and identities, because we will never reach an agreement on that. What we have to do, and I think this is one of the paradigm shifts that we have to think about from the Oslo, is treat these very core and very important issues, rather than issues of negotiation, as issues of an educational process, whereby you exclude people like myself, lawyers and diplomats, who know nothing about history and identity and who always inclined to use it in tactical terms, and have a process that is not about agreeing on a history or a narrative, but about sensitizing each other to the history and the narrative, and a process that is being led by people who are more in tune with national identity making, be it religious leaders, be it intellectuals, whatever it is. In terms of Sheikh Jabari, and to be honest, I do not know who this Sheikh Jabari is. But from your description, it seems to me that, yes, I mean, there are many in Palestine, around, I would say, if you cross the polls, around 30 to 35%, who do not believe in it. Who do believe in a state of perpetual conflict with Israel that will ultimately end with the removal, with the destruction. And I would argue that if the current leadership, which of that is being pushed aside, is not allowed to succeed and deliver, we are going to end up with stuff, which is who wants to protect it. And here again, I find I'm very because that's how you put it. There's a lot. It has a problem and I hope I do not believe that it's extremely constructive to sit here and to point out how bad the other side is. If at the end of the day, we have to look at what we want in the future. Do we want a perpetual conflict where all these problems, all these proper and right and accurate problems that we have identified will be perpetuated and will come back 20 years from now talking about, you name it, incitement, violence, etc.? Or do we want to start shifting towards a new paradigm? If we wait for the perfect conditions to happen, they will never happen. Things will only slide backwards, and this is, in my view, what actually at least informs my thinking and the way I approach this kind of cases.
Thank you very much, Ghaith. Mr. Danon will give you the last word here if you'd like to take a few minutes.
I would like to refer to the issue of Sheikh Jabari. You all hear about freedom of speech here in the US. I want to have a freedom of speech for people who do not believe in a two-state solution. And we don't have it, not in Israel and not here in Washington. And what we're trying to change it, and I think we did it somehow today, to say there is something else. And Sheikh Jabari, I don't know what his power, if he's powerful or not, but he has his own ideas, there are other ideas. And I say let's allow people to put out new ideas. And I think the idea that I'm putting on the table, which is applying Israeli sovereignty on the majority of the land in Judea and Samaria. We call it illegal annexation, but I don't feel we should annex something that belongs to us. But I say we apply the Israeli law not on the Palestinian population, on the vacant land and the Jewish community in Judea and Samaria. That's something we should promote. And by the way, we did it twice, without the support of the US. We did it in Jerusalem in 1967, where we adopted the decision that there is no East and West Jerusalem, and Menachem Begin, Prime Minister Begin, did it with the Golan Heights. And we were condemned by the US, by the UN, but it happened. And I think that's the goal we should promote, is to do an annexation in Judea and Samaria, and move on to the idea that we don't want to annex the Palestinian people, but we want to apply the law on the Israeli communities in the vacant land, And eventually, when there will be a real viable partner, there will be an agreement with Jordan and Egypt and the Palestinian leadership. But as of today, you cannot continue and speak only about either there will be a Palestinian state or nothing else. I think this is something we have to promote and not to be afraid to speak out.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments, all three of you today. I think, obviously, we all knew coming in that Oslo was in trouble. I think we've confirmed it. But it's very good to hear from people who are true experts on this. I should just make a quick note that for those who are interested in UNRWA, there is one thing that went unmentioned here. There is an initiative right now in Washington, if you're not aware, shepherded by Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois, who has been looking to make it U.S. policy to remove the descendants clause from UNRWA. So in other words, the original refugees from 48 or 67 are now estimated to be somewhere in the range of 30,000 or so. But what Senator Kirk wants to do is to make sure that the kids, the grandkids, and the great-grandkids no longer get the status of refugee. That could be a game changer, but nevertheless, I think there are still obviously issues that remain with UNRWA. I think we are going to conclude this panel. I want to thank all three of you very much. I'd like to give everybody a round of applause. Okay, very good. We are going to have a changing of the guards here. We had expected Congressman Elliot Engel to come. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us. And so I'd like to directly move to the second panel, which will include Rabbi Benny Elon, Dr. Yossi Beilin, and David Miller, if you'd like to come up and have a seat.